Hey gang, it's Platt, and today we're going to revisit my most popular video. It's something called Simplest Way to Make Booze, and that's really was the intent of it. If you haven't seen the video, I'll throw a link in somewhere up here for you to catch it, and if you have, then you know where we're going. To review what we did, I took a half gallon of 100% grape juice, poured a little bit out, threw a cup of sugar in there, and then threw some bread yeast in there, and we let that ferment for about 7 days, and then we had alcoholic beverage. We had basically something called, prison wine or whatever, but we had an alcoholic beverage that we can drink. We made alcohol. To quickly review what actually happens in the process is this yeast in here is actually a living organism. Right now it's dormant, but when we throw it in there, it rehydrates and it comes back alive. And what it wants to do is it wants to eat sugar. Think of it as like a little Pac-Man just eating sugar, and in the process it pees out alcohol and it farts out CO2. And that's basic fermentation, and that's what we did. Basically, we had a basic fermentation experiment and we created alcoholic beverage. So now I want to kind of go over questions, comments, and concerns I got about it, because I got hundreds of comments on the video, people asking different things. So I want to kind of go over some of the major points. First and foremost, I know this is a funnel. I call it a strainer video. It's a funnel. I made a mistake. Second, people question me, hey, this is not booze, it's wine. Booze is hard alcohol. If you look under the Webster's Dictionary, booze is kind of an all-encompassing term for alcoholic beverages, beer, wine, what have you. Normally it's used for hard spirits like vodka and gin and stuff like that, but it's booze. We're making booze. I used a term there that threw some people off. I said decant, that you could decant this. What that means is, if you did the experiment, on the very bottom we had a lot of dead yeast cells. Well, you don't want to drink that, so if you carefully pour off the liquid and make sure to pour in a way that you leave the yeast on bottom, it's called decanting. They do this sometimes in fancy restaurants that have old bottles of wine that have had some sediment settle. They'll go ahead, open it, and decant it for you at the table and let you drink it, so you're not worried about drinking sediment. And that's what I meant by decanting. Yeast-wise, I was slightly confusing in the video, and I wanted to review yeast. In the notes on the video, I said something about using 1 pack. You don't want to use a whole pack of this yeast. That's a little too much. In the video, I think I said I used half to a third of a package. That's still too much. A quarter to a fifth will get this done. We're only doing about 2 quarts, half gallon, so you don't need that much yeast. But it got the job done. If you put too much yeast, it's just too many yeast cells competing for a few sugar cells, and it kind of affects the yeast. So use a little less yeast if you try this. Another thing people say a lot of times, well, I had a cap blow off, or the bottle's getting tight, or this, that, and the other. What I did in the video was, after I put the yeast and the sugar and everything, I put the cap back on, but I didn't tighten it. I left it loose enough where air could come out. Remember, the yeast is producing CO2, and that CO2 needs to escape, or again, you'd have this bottle blow up. I just left the cap on, just loose enough, and you kind of squeeze the bottle and know that if air could come out or not. If you don't want to do it, don't trust that or whatever, you can use a balloon. Some people use condoms, and you can put it on, either poking a hole in the end of it that allows air out, or you can come by once a day or so, kind of open up that balloon, let the air out, and then let that balloon reinflate. That's up to you. If you know a home brewer, happen to be a home brewer near a shop or whatever, you can get one of these airlocks. You'll fill it with a little bit of water, and what it does is make sure that CO2 comes out, but nothing gets in. You don't want to leave this open and a fly get in there, or some kind of dust or atmosphere, something that could hurt the yeast too, microorganisms, whatever. So that's why we do that. Another point some people brought out was, they're like, hey, you don't need to use yeast, use raisins. In the fields, grapes have wild yeast coated on them, and classic way to make grapes was they would pick them, lay them out in the sun, let them shrivel up, what have you. In modern agriculture, with the spraying of certain chemicals and certain treatments and this, that, and the other, I'm not going to gamble. The reality is I got a grocery store near me or whatever. I've got access to bread yeast. We'll use that. But if you want to try the grape thing, the raisin thing, feel free. And there's some theory out there that the raisins also provide yeast nutrient or whatever. So, you know, feel free. That is an option. One of probably my most popular question was ABV. How much booze is in this? When I did this experiment, I did not take an ABV reading. However, I've used the bread yeast in several other experiments, and I generally got a 6 to 8% alcohol by volume range in those experiments. So that's probably about what you would get on something like this. Not guaranteed, but that's about the range. And one last thing people commented on was, hey, I tried Hawaiian fruit punch, or I tried a juice-like drink, or, you know, whatever, fruit punch kind of thing, and it didn't work. If you don't use 100% fruit juice, if you use one of these fruit juice drinks or whatever, a lot of times they have a lot of preservatives, and the yeast don't like those preservatives, so they're not going to work well. So if you want to do this experiment, please use 100% juice. And these juice drinks just most of the time won't work. Some may not. Again, it depends on the ratio of juice and this and that, but just to be safe, stick to 100% juice. So now I want to go over how can we make this better. That's a question I get. Well, how can I get more alcohol? How can it taste better? We'll do a couple simple things. One, the easiest thing really is the yeast. Instead of, like I said, bread yeast works, but it's not designed for this. So if you know a home brewer or whatever, you can use a beer yeast. You're not going to get much higher ABV because most beers are under 10%, and the yeast to produce them are kind of designed for that. But you might get some cleaner fermentation. You might get less of that kind of off taste that the bread yeast produces. Naturally, we're producing basically a poor man's wine. Use a wine yeast or a champagne yeast. And those make a lot of sense, A, because again, they're kind of created for this purpose, and B, they can hit higher alcohols. You know, if you look at a bottle of wine, you get in the low teens a lot of times on alcohol by volume. And so they're designed to have a little higher, hit a little higher alcohol. And last but not least, you could try something. I found a batch of this that I had from an old experiment or whatever. It's something called turbo yeast. This is something your spirits producer, people that make bourbon and scotch and rum and all that stuff, use. This yeast is designed to get as high as possible alcohol by volume in their fermented product, because that helps them get a higher yield out of the still. Not necessarily, this wouldn't necessarily make the best wine, but it would hit higher ABV. So if you somehow, you know, want to go online, or again, you had access to this, this is something you could try, and you could hit some really high ABVs, almost close to 20% alcohol by volume, using something like this. Another thing I got to ask, is something you could do if you want to tweak the ABV a little bit, is we can increase the sugar. Actually, grape juice that you get at the store has a lot less sugar than wine grapes. And the juice that's produced at a vineyard is a lot higher in sugar than this. In the video, we added a little bit of just regular cane sugar. We added a cup. If you want to add just a little bit more, you don't want to go over the top, because the yeast can't handle too much sugar. Kind of like if we eat too much, it's not good for us. Same thing with the yeast. You can also, if you want to add use like a cup of regular sugar, then maybe throw in some honey or an agave nectar or a liquid fructose on top of that. You can do that too. And, you know, just, you know, if you have the right yeast, if you're using a wine or champagne yeast or this turbo yeast, feel free to add in a little bit more sugar, and you can push your ABV a little bit more. Last but not least, in the suggestions on how to improve this, is we're going to let it ferment longer. In our experiment, we did 7 days. And again, we got an alcoholic beverage, one of the best tasting, but it did. If we let this ferment out a little bit longer, we let the yeast a little bit more, hopefully finish eating all the sugar they can, we can also do what's called a secondary fermentation. This is done a lot of home brewing, where we would let this go for 7 days. And in those 7 days, that's where the bulk of the activity, and you get a lot of bubbling or whatever. And around 7th days, it starts to simmer down. But what we do is after that happens, we would decant it off that old dead yeast, because we don't want that sitting around because it'll affect the taste. And then we'll put it in a new fermenter, one of these fermenter, 1 gallon fermenters, and we'll let it go for a couple more weeks. And we'll let the still active yeast cells will still come over in that new batch, and we'll let them finish out completely, maybe produce a little bit more alcohol, and more importantly, kind of let it mellow out and complete the fermentation. A lot of times in beers, they'll do a primary fermentation for a week, but then in the secondary, they may let it go 2-3 weeks, month plus. And they've seen where that improves the flavor. So that's something you might do on this. In fact, we are going to do this. We're going to do a little experiment now. What we're going to do is I'm going to do 1 batch regularly like we did, but this time I'm going to do an alcohol reading so we can finally get an official answer on that first video. And then we're going to do a second batch where I use one of these 1 gallon fermenters, and I'm going to use a wine yeast. I'm going to add a little extra sugar. We're going to do a secondary fermentation. We're going to let this ferment out. And so we're going to test the alcohol in both, and then we're going to do a taste test and see how that works out. So let's get started on our experiment. Okay, gang, so our little experiment is we're going to do 2 different batches. The one on the right is kind of like the original one I did. We just poured out a little of the juice in a 2-quart or half gallon juice container. I threw in a cup of sugar, and I used the bread yeast. This time I only used even less than 1/4 of a pack of the bread yeast. Also this time I did what's called a gravity reading. That will help us determine how much alcohol is in there. That gravity reading came in at 1.095. And on the left here we're doing a gallon batch. This time though I'm using wine yeast. We're going to let it ferment a little longer. Remember the original one we did about 7 days, and that's what we're going to do with the one on the right. The one on the left though, we're going to do a primary fermentation for 7 days. Then we're going to siphon it off, leave the old yeast in the bottom, and let it do a secondary fermentation in another container for another 2 weeks. We also added additional sugar. On the right we put 1 cup for a half gallon. Here on the left we had a gallon here, but I ended up putting 3 cups in. So 1.5 cups per half gallon. So we got extra sugar, we're using wine yeast, and we're going to let it ferment longer. So we're going to let these go, and then I'm going to come back when they're both finished fermenting, and I'm going to do another gravity reading to see how much alcohol we got, and also taste the difference, or see what kind of, if we can make it taste any better or about the same. So I will see you guys in about 3 weeks. All right, gang, we're going to wrap up our simplest way to make booze revisited video, where we kind of go back over this experiment. Before we get going, I want to go over a term I used earlier in the video, decanting. Earlier in the video, I said that you would decant to get the wine off the yeast, and that is true. But you also, if you decant like a real high-end bottle of old wine at a nice steakhouse or whatever, you also do that to open up the wine. You expose it to air, let it open up, let it rest a little bit before you drink it. So that's another reason why you would decant wine. As far as our experiment goes, we did 2 batches, one like we did in the first video, and another one where we used a little more sugar, we used wine yeast instead of bread yeast, and we let it ferment longer. We allowed this one to ferment for 1 week, we allowed this to ferment for 3 weeks. Also, I did a gravity reading to see how much alcohol we got this time. This batch started off at 1.095 and had a final gravity of 1.005. And that gets us to around 11% alcohol by volume, which is higher than what I said at the start of the video. And I got to thinking, why that is. Earlier in the video, I said that I didn't do a gravity reading the first time we tried this experiment, and that I just was basing it off other times I'd used bread yeast. Well, I got to thinking I'd used bread yeast in like making cider and some other stuff. Well, in those videos, I didn't add additional sugar, so that's probably why we got a little bit higher ABV. I'm going to say, just as a general guess, anytime anybody does this experiment with the sugar, you're probably going to be around 10% plus, just in that 10 range. As far as the second batch, where we use the wine yeast and add additional sugar and additional time, our original gravity was 1.15, and our final gravity came out to 1.03, and that gave us an ABV of 15.75%. So we can see the extra sugar, the yeast, and the extra time works. We get a higher gravity, and it's something that is very close to wine you'd find in a store, which runs 13 to 16% for most of your wines out there. So you can see that really worked. Now the other part of the experiment is we want to see if we can taste a difference. So I've got an example of both. Let's give her a try. Well, I'm going to say that's not too, well, the first taste, I got a little sweetness. Started off nice. It's the aftertaste that'll get you. You definitely taste that bread yeast, and it kind of lingers. That being said, I could see where, especially as for prison wine, that would do in a pinch. Let's give this another try. If I was doing a proper wine taste, I'd have a little bucket, maybe some water, but we'll skip that. Oh, wow. No, this is different. You still get a lot of that sweetness, a lot of that fruit on there, but there's no aftertaste. Very drinkable. The viscosity's right. Yeah, this makes a difference. So I'm going to say, if you want to do this experiment, or if you want something of quality and you have access, get a wine yeast. Let this ferment out a little bit longer. Actually, let me try that again. This ain't not too bad if I say so myself. As far as ramping this experiment up, or what else you could do, maybe throw some fruit in there for it, but basically, I want to say it's yeast that's really the big difference, because in the base experiment, it's the yeast aftertaste that's kind of tough. If you got any more questions, if there's something I haven't covered as far as this experiment, or if you got another idea, please feel free to leave it in the comments section, or you can always contact me on the Twitter page. And I hope you like this video, so please subscribe down below. Well, until next time, bottoms up.